Hi everyone, thank you so much for making the time to join me at this session of Microsoft Build 2021. My name is Cecil Phillip and I'm a Senior Cloud Advocate here at Microsoft. And what we're going to be doing here is spending some time getting to learn about Dapr, the Distributed Application Runtime. And I want to show you how Dapr makes it so much easier for developers to add those microservice patterns and practices inside of the application that you're trying to build. What I'll do is give you a brief overview about what Dapr is, what are some of the problems that it's trying to solve, some of the goals that it has, and I promise there are going to be demos too, so you'll see exactly what it takes to add Dapr to your application. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Now, when you take a look across the microservice ecosystem, there's so many tools for us to choose from when it comes to carrying on any particular tasks. So for instance, I might need something to help me with pub/sub messaging between my different components. Or maybe I need a tool to help me do configuration management and secrets management. Or maybe I need something with state management to be able to store data for my application. And like I mentioned before, there's so many different options for us to choose from within each of these respective categories. But now as developers, we have to spend the time to try and figure out, well, what's going to be the right combination of these tools for the application that we're trying to build? Some other things we should think about are, well, what does the hosting support look like? What operating systems does it run on? Does it run on the cloud or does it run on premises? And what about programming language support? Are there SDKs and libraries that I could use to really plug these things a lot easier into my app? And these are just some of the things that we have to think about, but trying to sort this stuff out really takes up a lot of time. And this is valuable time that we could be using to add business value instead to our applications. So what the Dapr team did is they looked at some of those patterns and practices that seem to be very common across microservice developers, and they created a set of abstractions that made it a little bit easier for us to add them inside of our applications. And this is kind of how Dapr came about. Also, it was important for Dapr to be a very lightweight process that was host agnostic. So that means that regardless of whether you're running on premises or on the cloud, you should be able to use Dapr. Some other things to take note of is Dapr is very extensible. It works with any programming languages, and it's also open source. So that means that you can start contributing to Dapr if you want, but we also have tons of contributors that are adding new features to it all the time. Why don't we dive a little bit deep and I can talk to you about some of these abstractions that Dapr provides. Now, the foundations of Dapr are based on a particular set of abstractions that we like to refer to as building blocks. And each building block represents a use case that's important for microservice developers today. So for example, you could see that we have a building block for service-to-service invocation. And this essentially acts like a type of service discovery. So that means that if service A needs to speak with service B, it doesn't need to know where it lives or what node that it's on. All it needs to do is send that message through Dapr, and it'll figure out, well, how do I route the message between those two services? Another thing that we have is state management. We can see there's building blocks for publish, subscribe, even actors, secrets management. There's even a building block for observability that'll help us manage our distributed traces and metrics and logging. Now, behind each of these building blocks is a particular implementation of that service. But the client that's making the request doesn't need to know anything about that implementation. So that means that it doesn't need to have any specific implementation SDKs or configuration settings. All it needs to do is route that through Dapr, and Dapr will figure out, well, what's the configured service that's going to be able to handle this thing for us. And the way that we communicate with these different building blocks is by using HTTP or gRPC. So that makes it really easy so that most programming languages should be able to just communicate with Dapr using one of these two endpoints. So now, using your programming language of choice, you can integrate with any of these different building blocks using the well-defined URLs or API contracts that are made available via Dapr. It's also worth noting that Dapr provides official SDKs for a variety of programming languages. So if you don't feel like working directly with your HTTP client or gRPC client within your app, you can make use of a Dapr SDK for your given language. That'll make things a little bit easier. Now, why don't we take a look at an architecture example? Imagine with me for a second that your application architecture looks a little bit like this. Inside of here, you see that we have two microservices, service A and service B. What you'll also notice is that each service has an associated Dapr sidecar. Now, our Dapr sidecar is just that lightweight process that's going to be deployed on localhost right next to your application. So now that means that anytime service A or service B needs to work with Dapr or invoke one of its services, it'll just speak directly to the sidecar calling that Dapr API. Let's say, for instance, that service A needed to invoke a method that lives on service B. Well, service A doesn't know where it is, so it can rely on that service-to-service invocation building block and just speak directly to the Dapr sidecar. And since the Dapr sidecars will be able to figure out where all of the other ones live, it'll be responsible for funneling that request over to the sidecar that knows about that service and handing it off to service B. And then vice versa, whenever the response is ready, it'll be routed all the way back to service A. Well, what about some of the other building blocks? What if I needed to manage state or do some type of messaging? And what's great is that my service can just speak directly to that Dapr sidecar and have it funnel that request on to the right implementation of the thing that's going to handle that request. So imagine now I needed to store some state. I don't need to know that it's being hosted in Cassandra or Cosmos DB or even Redis. Again, Dapr is going to handle that for me. Or let's say I needed to publish a message on some type of message broker. I don't care that it's RabbitMQ or Azure Service Bus or NATS, right? Dapr will handle that for me. And all my code needs to know about is how do I communicate with that Dapr sidecar. And like I mentioned before, Dapr is a very lightweight process that's very host agnostic. So I can host it in Kubernetes, for instance, and I can run it right side my application container inside of the same pod, or I can run it in a VM, or just run it on my machine on localhost. But it's going to be the same version of Dapr that I'm running in all of these places. There's nothing special or different about it. Now let's move on and see what it looks like to actually leverage one of these common building blocks. So why don't we take a look at publish subscribe? What you'll notice here is that I have a service called cart, and then like I mentioned before, it's going to have its associated Dapr sidecar. Now what you're seeing at the bottom is that well-defined URL that it's going to communicate with to let Dapr know, well, I want to publish a message onto some messaging service. Here's the topic and the associated data for that topic. And what Dapr will do is it'll look at its configuration and figure out, well, what's the configured thing that's going to be able to handle this? And now on the other side, we'll have another set of services along with their associated Dapr sidecars that'll be listening for the publishing of those messages. And whenever those messages come in, the sidecars will just funnel them into their respective services. And now I think this building block particularly offers some really interesting scenarios. So you can imagine maybe you're working on localhost and you want to work with a particular messaging provider, but maybe it doesn't have an instance that runs on your machine. Well, maybe in development mode, I can rely on a local instance of another messaging provider, but then whenever I deploy to the cloud or deploy to my production infrastructure, I could use whichever one is configured over there, like Azure Service Bus, for instance. But the great thing is that I don't have to change my code. It should work exactly the same way. And again, the SDKs aren't different. I'm not changing any different configuration inside of my application itself because I'm just relying on those abstractions that Dapr provides. Now, I think that's enough talking for now. Why don't we go ahead and dive into some demos so you can see exactly what it feels like to start working with Dapr. What you're looking at here is our Contoso Crafts demo application, and it's a fairly simple web application that has a list of products that we might want to check out. So for instance, I can click on this info button to get some more detailed information about an item. I could click on the add to cart button, for instance, and now I'll start adding things to my shopping cart. I can hit this button on the top right to view my shopping cart, and then I can hit the submit button, and now that work order will be sent to get processed in the background. Why don't we head over to Visual Studio and I could show you the code that actually makes up this app. Now this application is actually made up of 3 different microservices. There's our Blazor front-end web service that's written with Blazor WebAssembly. There's our products API that retrieves our product data from a MongoDB database and returns it to us in a JSON format. And lastly, there's our checkout processor that's just sitting in the background listening for messages to get published on a queue, and then we'll start processing that work for the checkout. Now this app has already been Dapperized. Here inside of the solution, you'll see I have a Docker Compose file. And essentially this just makes it easier for me to run all these different services on my machine. But what I want to show you is for each of these services, I have an associated Dapr sidecar. So what you'll see here is that I have my website service defined, but right next to it, I have its associated Dapr sidecar. And then I have my products API, I have my products API sidecar. And my checkout processor sidecar. I think you kind of get the point now, right? For every service that's going to be playing in that Dapr ecosystem, it's going to have an associated sidecar. Now let's take a look at our website sidecar. And you'll see that I'm pulling in that Dapr image and I'm just running this command. And the options in this command just let Dapr know that I have a service called website running on port 80. And also notice there's a -config. That points to some of the Dapr configuration for some of the components that we're going to use. But we'll get to that a little bit later. These other options that you're seeing at the bottom are just for Docker Compose, and they're not specific to Dapr at all. If I close this one and I head over to my Products API Dapr, you're going to see something very similar. I'll have an app ID of Products API, which is also running on port 80. It's important that we have a unique service name here because that's the name that we're going to use whenever we want to use service-to-service invocation inside of Dapr. Now, let's head over to our Blazor application and take a look at the chproj file. One of the easiest ways to get started with Dapr if you're using ASP.NET Core is by using the dapr.asp.NET Core NuGet package. If you're using another programming language and another web framework, definitely check out our documentation because they might be a package for you as well. Now, to get this set up, I'm going to head over to the startup.cs file. And inside of my configure services, you can notice that when I make that call to add controllers, I also add an add Dapr. And this will add things like the Dapr client and some other important services to the dependency injection container. So now that we have Dapr inside of our app, let me show you how we actually use it. So I'm going to head to this services folder, and you'll notice that I have a class called Dapr product service. And inside of this product service, I'm taking a dependency on the Dapr client, and now I have a set of methods that I can start using inside of my Blazor app. Let's take a look at get products. So if I open this up, you can see that I'm using the Dapr client to make a service invocation call to the products API. And if you remember where we saw that Docker Compose file, you know exactly where that name came from. And then that last parameter is the actual method that they want to invoke. Since products API is a RESTful service, this is just making a GET request to a /products endpoint. On line 50, you could see that we're using the Dapr client again to invoke the request, and that returns a type of HTTP response message. And that should be a fairly familiar type that you may have seen before if you've ever worked with HTTP client inside of .NET. Then you can see that we inspect the results, and then we just return it to our caller. So now after we get the results back, we just inspect the status code, and then we send those results back over to our Blazor client. But one of the important things I want you to notice here, at no point in time did you ever see me list the address of that products API. I don't know what port it's listening on. I don't know what the IP address is. All I'm doing is just communicating with Dapr, and I'm letting Dapr handle that service discovery for me. Let's take a look at another example inside of this class. If we take a look at the get product operation, this particular method is responsible for getting the details of a single item. Now, you see on line 34, I'm still making use of the Dapr client, and I'm calling create invoke method request. We're still making that call over to our product services API, but in this case, because we want to go to a particular route, which is products / and the ID of the product, notice how I'm adding that little token there inside of the request. But everything else in the method should look pretty similar, right? I call invoke method with response on line 35. I inspect their status code, and then I return the results back to the caller. Now, what if we wanted to use a method that did something other than a get request? Let's take a look at add rating. This method is responsible for adding ratings to individual products. Notice that it accepts the product ID and also the rating that we want to attach to that particular product. Again, on line 22, we're making use of that Dapr client, and we're calling create invoke request method. But this time, instead of making a get request, I'm making a put request. I'm still using the same service ID, which is product APIs. The endpoint is going to be /products. But again, what's different now is that I'm passing in an optional payload. And what will happen is that whenever the put request is made, this payload will be serialized into JSON and added to the request as it goes over. Then if I scroll back over a little bit, you can see on line 24, again, I'm calling that invoke method async with Dapr. And while this is an optional SDK, and you can always use HTTP client if you wanted to make direct requests to that Dapr sidecar, I think this helps with having us write a little bit less code whenever we want to work with Dapr. All right, let's close these up, and let's take a look at the rest of the project. Here's another interesting thing that I want you to take a look at. Let's head over to that products API service. I'm going to hit the chproj, and do you notice that I don't even have the Dapr SDK listed here as a dependency? And that's because unless I'm actually making calls to Dapr, I actually don't even need to have it. All I have to do is run Dapr and point it to my API, and now I've just Dapperized my application. Now, if this particular API was making use of any of those other building blocks for Dapr, then it'll be a good idea for me to pull in that SDK and start making requests. All right, next up, why don't we talk about the checkout processor and see how that works? I'm going to head back to that Dapr product service that I showed you a little bit earlier. Let's close this method, and instead, let's look at the checkout method. You might notice that there's actually not a lot happening here. I'm going to use that Dapr client to publish an event over to the event bus. The three things I need to give it is the name of the bus And here I just have this as a constant string. I need to give it the topic, and I need to give it the list of items that I want to have sent over into that payload. But other than having to know the name of the pub sub component that I want to use, I don't actually know anything else about it. If I take a look at my settings, you'll notice that nothing in here tells me anything about what message broker I'm using. All I'm doing is just relying on Dapr to figure it out. Next, once this message gets placed on the queue, the checkout processor is going to be there to listen to those messages. Now, let's go ahead and check out the startup CS for this one. Again, this looks very similar to the ones that we saw before. I'm going to call add controllers, and then I'm going to add Dapr to add those Dapr services to it. But also, if you take a look at line 26, you notice that I'm also calling something called map subscribe handler. And what this will do is let Dapr know that this service wants to subscribe to messages that come across a particular topic. But how do I actually let Dapr know what are those topics that I care about? And what's the code that's going to handle it whenever they come in? So I'm going to open the controllers folder, still in under the checkout processor. I'm going to click on this Dapr controller. And what you'll notice here on line 20 is that I have an attribute here called topic. And this is actually coming from Dapr. I'm letting it know that I want to listen to the RabbitMQ bus for a checkout topic. And this action method that's below here is what's going to be responsible for processing those messages. But just like before, if I look in the settings for this project, it knows nothing about message brokers or endpoints or IP addresses or ports or anything like that for where these messages are going. The only thing that I'm doing is speaking to Dapr. So you're like, all right, Cecil, I get it. All we'd have to do is talk to Dapr. But how do we actually configure these components so that Dapr knows where exactly these messages need to go? Now, if you recall, and I'm going to briefly head back over to that Docker Compose file that I showed you. If you remember, I had that section that pointed to a configuration file. And this configuration is where I have all the setup for those components that I want to use. So if we scroll to the top here, you'll notice in this solution, I have a folder called components. So let's take a look and see what we have in here. So if we open up this local file, you can see I have a few components in here set up. If I open this one that says RabbitMQ pub sub, you may notice that that name on line 4 may look a little bit familiar. It says RabbitMQ bus. And that's the component that we've been using inside of our applications to send and receive those messages. So now here you can see how exactly we configure it inside of Dapr. So a couple things that are important for Dapr configuration. It needs to have a type. So in this case, this one is pub sub RabbitMQ. And then also in the metadata, we have to give it some information about how do we configure the service. So here you can see that I'm giving it the host name with the IP address, along with some other options that might be important for it to use. And now that's all we need to do. So now whenever we start up our Dapr sidecar, it's going to look at this information and all the other components that are inside of this folder and configure those building blocks to enable the functionalities using these implementations. Let's go ahead and check out another item. So I'm going to click that, hit submit. Now if we head over to RabbitMQ, in just a few seconds, we should see our item pop up here on the chart. But another thing that I want you to notice is that inside of Dapr, there's a lot of things that were created that I actually didn't create. So for instance, you can see here that there's a checkout exchange that Dapr created for us. And if we head over to queues, there's also a Dapr Rabbit checkout queue. Again, another thing that Dapr created for us. This is not something that I did. But because we have that configured, Dapr knows how to work with RabbitMQ and some of these other services to get this stuff taken care of. Let's take a look at some of the other components that we can use. Here's an example of using Redis to be used as a state store. So just like before, we have to give it a name, we have to specify the type, and then we have to give it that metadata that'll let us know how do we get that configuration information. Now, you may notice something that's a little bit different about this part. And that is, instead of me having hard-coded values for my passwords, instead I'm using a secret store. And a secret store is yet another component that could be configured inside of Dapr. So you might be wanting to use something like Azure Key Vault or HashiCorp Vault, or maybe even using just a local JSON file for local development. You can do that as well. And I actually have examples of that inside of here, so you can check that out whenever you look at the code. Now, the last thing I want to show you is what the tracing support looks like. So if I click here on the Dependencies tab inside of Zipkin, I have a Zipkin container running as a part of my Docker Compose. If I click on Search, what you'll notice here is that it gives us this really interesting graph that shows us our different services, but also who's communicating with what. So if you can see that little dot that's kind of like moving along the line there, that means that, well, our website component talks to the checkout processor. But then you might at some point see another one that goes between website and products. That means that, there's also communication going this way as well. And we were able to do this by configuring Zipkin inside of Dapper. But one thing I really want you all to keep in mind, as we take a look at those different applications again, you can see as I look at my CS proj files, none of these things know about Zipkin. None of them know about RabbitMQ. There's no specific APIs or SDKs that are created to work with these things. We're really just relying on the power of Dapper to do that for us. So now our developers could really just focus on the business code and not have to worry so much about setting up some of these other components. And as those components get swapped out, our code doesn't have to change, only the Dapper configuration. And before I forget, let me show you how we set up Zipkin inside of Dapper. Now I'm going to head back to my components folder here inside of my solution. And inside of here, you'll notice I have another file called config.yaml. Now when I click on that, I want you to notice that this configuration is how we set up our distributed tracing across all of our components in Dapper. So you can see that I have a specification starting on line 6. And now I'm enabling the tracing support. So you can see I have a sampling rate, and also I have a configuration for Zipkin. Now Zipkin is just another container that's running inside of my Docker Compose file. So what I'm doing here is providing the address along with the port that Dapper can use to communicate with that instance of Zipkin. But now that's all you really needed to set up Zipkin inside of Dapper to start collecting some of that tracing information. Now, the next thing you might be wondering is, well, how do I know what are the different configuration options that are available whenever I'm setting up these components? And well, that's what the docs are for. So if you head over to dapr.io and you click on the docs link, you should be able to find all this type of information. So you can see here, if I click on the left side, I'll go to reference and component specs. I could select the type of building block that I want to use. So let's say I wanted to check out the pub sub one. As you saw in my example, I was using RabbitMQ. So if I click on the RabbitMQ section, you can see here are all of the different options that are available for me to set that up. And as we scroll down, we can see descriptions of all of the different options, what are required, and even what are some of those default values. And even if you didn't want to use RabbitMQ or use something else like Redis or Nats, again, these options are all here in the documentation. So as you're using Dapper, I definitely want to recommend that you head over to the documentation to learn about all of the different things that are available for you to configure. Now, that's not the only thing that you'll find in the documentation. You also need to know how to use the component from the client side. So in the reference section, you can click on the Dapper API. And again, let's say we want to look at the PubSub API reference. If you don't want to use the SDKs, you can definitely check out the API references for all of the different building blocks. As you can scroll through here, you can see the endpoints that you need to call, the different HTTP status and response codes that it returns to you, and then even what the header is and the type of payload that you need to pass over whenever you're interacting with these things. Now, if you want to know how to get Dapper set up on your machine, head over to the Get Started section. And here, you can click on Install the Dapper CLI, and it'll provide you options for whatever operating system that you're using. So whether it's Windows, Linux, or even Mac OS. You can probably tell that I'm a big fan of developer documentation because this is the main way that you can learn how to use some of these really cool open source tools. And another great thing I love about Dapper is not only are the tools open source, but so is the documentation. So for instance, if you wanted to contribute, you can simply click on the Edit This Page link, or even head over to the GitHub repo and start sending pull requests and contributions over there. All right, that's it. That's it for our demo. Now, while we didn't have a tremendous amount of time, there's so many more capabilities that are built into Dapper that we didn't even have a chance to get into. As an example, if you're interested in building anything using the actor model, there is support for virtual actors inside of Dapper. We actually have a lot of customers that are using this for things like IoT scenarios as an example. Also, if you want to talk about something like workflows, maybe you want to have your workflows managed in Dapper, we have support for that, where you can actually run an instance of Azure Logic Apps inside of your Dapper application, which is really cool. Now, this feature is still in preview, so I definitely recommend that you head over to GitHub and share any feedback that you might have. Another thing that I think is really cool is having the ability to interact with Azure Functions inside of Dapper as well. So you can have that Azure Functions programming model along with the power of Dapper, which I think is a great marriage when you put them together. Now, like I said before, we didn't have a tremendous amount of time to really dive deep and look at every single option that's available for configuring Dapper, but I hope at least that this session would give you a little bit of inspiration and encourage you to try out some of the features and let us know if it works well for your application. Now, if you're interested in joining our online Dapper community, we have some links to things like our Discord channel, YouTube, and even Twitter, where you can use it to interact with the team and the rest of the Dapper community. Also, if you're a .NET developer and you want a little bit more of a reference about how you can start using Dapper today, definitely check out the Dapper for .NET Developers ebook, which is freely available for you to download or even read online as you wish. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. That's it for this session. I hope you enjoy the rest of Microsoft Build, and definitely let us know what you end up building with Dapper.